All right, I bet that we're live.
Hey.
All right. As folks are joining, welcome. Don't know that anybody's joined quite yet, but as you are joining, this is the Facebook Live book launch for Lost and Found. So we'll just give a few minutes for folks to join. Yeah. All right. Welcome to those who have joined, expecting some more folks to join throughout the event. This is the virtual book launch for Lost and Found, How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us and Three Keys to Fix It. We are joined by the author himself, Mark D'Souza, MD, MD squared, as well as a special guest, Dr. Rima Azar. So we'll go ahead and get started. What we're going to do is some brief introductions to the author and our guest. And then we'll start with some questions about the book, introduce the book to the folks who have tuned in. There will be at least one and potentially two readings from the book. We are also hoping to take some questions from the audience. We'll be asking those to both the author and our guest throughout the course of the event. Just for folks' reference, the author, Mark D'Souza, who I'll introduce in a moment, has an op-ed being published tomorrow in the National Post, so be on the lookout for that. There is also going to be an episode of the Full Comment podcast in which Dr. D'Souza is interviewed. That will be coming out in the next week or so, so stay tuned for that. We'll go ahead and get started. So without further ado, Mark D'Souza, MD, is a Canadian physician based in Toronto with extensive experience in addiction and chronic pain management. His medical practice, coupled with a lifelong passion for the humanities, provides a unique perspective on societal issues. He has published serial opinion editorials in Canada and has had extensive local media exposure, including TV and radio appearances and advocacy roles in healthcare organizations. Dr. D'Souza is on the faculty at Queen's University's Department of Family Medicine. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks so much, Josh.
I've actually had the pleasure of knowing Mark for a better part of a year now. Couldn't be happier to get this book launched into the world so you guys can read it. I feel like I've seen behind the curtain. I got to read it before you did. We are also joined, though, by special guest, Dr. Rima Azar. Welcome, Rima. Rima is an associate professor of health psychology at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Where she founded the Psychobiology of Stress in Health Lab. Over her career, she has worked with newborns, children, adolescents, and their families, both as a stress researcher and as a developmental clinician. Welcome to both Mark and to Rima.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so for those who have just joined, we are going to get started with some Q&A. This is our virtual book launch for Lost and Found, How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us, and Three Keys to Fix It. I'll just say once again, and probably a few more times, there's going to be an op-ed about wokeness in Canadian medicine written by Mark, published in the National Post tomorrow. There's also going to be a podcast episode where he is interviewed on the Full Comment podcast within the next week or so, so be on the lookout for that. But to get started talking about the book, Mark, just for those who are tuned in, so some folks might know you, some folks maybe have recently discovered you, maybe they found out about you because of this book. Can you just let us know, sort of introductory level, what is the book about? And can you also tell us and the viewers a little bit about how our guest Rima played a part in inspiring the book?
Thanks so much, Josh, and thanks for the introduction. For me, very briefly, first, it's surreal for this moment to finally be here. I never thought a little bit about how I end up starting to write the book, which will dovetail nicely, I think, into what the book is about. I started writing about 3 years ago. Just really the target audience was a single person, and that was me. It was me to try to figure out. I think everyone can feel that there was a shift in the world somewhere in the last decade where we got very divided, and increasingly so. Tribal is probably the word that people are most familiar with. And so I wanted to write down in pen questions I was asking myself is, why are we so divided? What is wrong with the world? And why do people take opioids? Because I was deep in an addictions medicine practice at the time. So, and then almost 3 years later to be here is I feel very grateful today. So thanks to all of you and anyone that's bought the book and reading it. I feel very honored. So as I started to pen those thoughts together, never actually thinking, I never had that intention that I was going to, okay, I'm going to write a book, I'm going to publish, I'm going to get a virtual launch day with Rima Azar. I never thought about that. It was just answering that questions for me. But they ended up congealing into the chapters of the book, and I just took one next step after the next, and 3 years later, here we are. The book has 3 sections. So the first section is really how we got here. So very abstractly, I talk about the death of God, but more practically speaking, that could be the lack of the splintering of this unifying story that we all know and understand, and keeps us as a coherent society. The second part of the book is I try to walk through the most common and popular faulty belief systems that I think have taken people for a ride and doesn't actually sustain people with meaning, when meaning to me was the answer that, as you might see with my first reading, meaning was the lack of meaning is the answer to ultimately why we're so divided and why people take opioids. For example, one of those moments, you see how someone threw soup at the Mona Lisa. Why are these faulty? I call them replacement religions, but why are they so attractive and pervasive? And why are they taking the masses, and why are they so popular? The third part of the book is the most important part of the book, because I actually, in my edits, I tried to really make the argument of the 3 keys to fix it. So how do we actually get back? Because the book it was hopeful for me, and so I hope that it is going to be hopeful, without using that word too much. That is going to be a hopeful message for people that read it. And so the next question really was, without doing any spoilers on the 3 keys, but the next question was how did Rima, or Professor Azar Bambi, as she's known on the internet, how did she inspire me? Well, I actually heard about her case in an interview by a famous podcaster, Jordan Peterson, and I was just appalled at what had happened when she was canceled by her university for very vague reasons. And to me, it was like a lot of the cancellations, a lot of angry and depressed people that do, to be frank, that are given veto power over people, and they get to manifest that by canceling people that actually have achieved something in life. And what I saw in Rima's cancellation was a reflection that if they can come for Rima, they can come for me, they can come for you, Josh, they can come for anybody who's listening. They can come for anybody. So, but Rima's story is one of hope, though. So maybe you want to tell how the rest of that story went?
Sure. My story started on February 22nd, 2021, so in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I don't know about you, Josh, Mark, and people listening to us, but for me, the pandemic was like war. So it taught me that hardship brings the best and the worst of human nature. So with you, it brought the best, and I will explain to our listeners. You supported me. First, you made a generous donation, you probably forgot, but you supported me in my legal battle. And then you wrote to me extending your hand through the email, the hand that I saw, a hand of humanity and compassion. And with the support of everyone, I got incredible support. I'll take it to the grave because I'm very grateful. So I want to say that. And you wrote a book of hope. You called it Hope Indeed. The title is Lost and Found. We're not just lost now, we're gonna hopefully find ourselves. So I think that's the best part. Now, the worst part of human nature is, of course, I call it the ugly part, is when we find ourselves indulging in canceling, as they say, or censoring, or call it whatever you want to call it. In the end, at the end of the day, it's abuse, a form of abuse, censoring someone we do not agree with. In my case, it's a personal blog, which is even, I find, more shocking because it's not related to the work. But for some reason, some people didn't like some posts or questions I raised or things I said. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
I had just
I'm
to
honored. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
Oh yeah, just to follow up on where I had started writing it for myself at the time when I reached out to Rima, but I let her know at the time I was working on it, and almost as if to encourage me to, no, I've already given some of my word. I better see this project through. And because at that time I'd already known that the defense of free speech was integral to the found part of my message. And so seeing her case and see her fight through it was inspiring to, no, I got to keep going.
Thank you.
I was inspired by your story, Rima, and I don't think you could say hope too many times. I think we could use a little bit of hope in our lives. But I'm honored to be with both of you. Thank you for joining. For folks on the live stream, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them as a comment. We will actually have some time for Mark and Rima to answer your questions. But to start us off, I am going to ask a question. I'm actually going to read a quote from the book, and I'm going to see if we can maybe talk about what it means. The first one is really interesting. The quote is, "Conservatives need liberal opinions, and liberals need conservative opinions." I am from Washington, D.C., and this is something that people say but don't mean. But you really mean it, Mark. What does it mean to you, this idea that conservatives and liberals need each other's ideas and opinions?
Well, many things. It depends on how deep we want to go. I think one of the worst travesties that's gone on is that it's so easy. Now you see it on the news, but also within your own family and friends, unfortunately, circles. Someone has political differences than me, therefore they are evil. And that's probably the worst manifestation of it. But when you look at the news, especially now with the American election coming up, and all throughout the Western world, it's like the other side is evil. Some conservatives would think that liberals are evil, and some liberals think that conservatives are evil, and then you don't have to actually listen to the other side. And then we end up with our tribe, our echo chamber. I found that in the research for this book that there's a lot of genetic predisposition tilting people towards liberal or conservative viewpoints, that it's baked into our DNA. So to say that, and it's about 50% of the population votes right, 50% votes less on average in the last few elections anyways. So to say that half your country is evil and I don't have to listen to them is extremely narcissistic, and it's causing the divide and the rift to widen. Whereas what you want to do is be able to say, hey, the other person's perspective may be valuable, which I make a case for free speech and the importance of seeing contrary opinions and engaging in debate in the book. But there's another angle to this that I found in the research for the book. Was a famous psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. He did some digging and some research into what he coined the moral foundations. So there are 5 moral principles. For example, one of them is fairness. People that have a conservative bent value them differently than people that have a liberal bent. And so while not everyone is coming from a pure place, I think it's safe to, when you're engaging in trying to talk to the other side, someone with a different political opinion, it's safe and extremely productive to assume that they actually mean well. They're coming from a moral place. They just may have a different moral imperative than you are, and start from there and see where the conversation goes. Rima?
I agree. And sometimes good ideas can come from the right, from the left. Bad ideas can come from the right and the left. So definitely I agree. And I want to say something, if I may. I read it this morning in the Journal de Montréal by sociologist and columnist Dr. Mathieu Bocoté. He wrote, it's like, it made me think, because the elite is more to the left, right? And so he was saying, if more people from the left side do not buy those woke ideas or ideologies and say, no, we don't want our beautiful left to be taken over by these trends, less people will be tempted to go to the extreme right. And I'm saying not the extreme right the way they say it to people when they want to cancel them. I've been called far right, but I'm talking about extremes. But I want to bring another nuance from myself this time. I think a society can afford to have a bit of extremes, like the tail of a normal curve, as long as the extremes are not harming or, having opinions. People are free, right? So you can be whatever the topic, like in Canada, in the USA, in the Middle East, now with what is happening. The problem is that we are not listening to each other and calling each other evil, as you said.
Just to take that and run with it a little bit, Rima. So I do make the case in a little bit. Well, I do make the case in my book, but also in the op-ed tomorrow and on the podcast coming up, that unfortunately there is a small group of people with an outsized voice that have a little bit too much control over the narrative, and they are not the ones that actually want to speak. So, I try to equip readers in the book with a way of teasing out who is willing to have an honest conversation or not. And So you ideally can have productive dialogue with as many people as possible, but it won't be 100% of people.
Actually, I'm sure we'll talk about this today. I like how in the book you talk a lot about self-censoring and how often we self-censor at work. And you make a really interesting point about people who are sort of far right of center, and even like left of center. All of us self-censor. It's only the people who are very far left who don't self-censor. And it's like 7% of the population, and they sort of have the loudest voice, which is interesting, particularly in the context of thinking about conservatives listening to liberals' opinions and vice versa. How do we do that if one side is sort of yelling louder than the other side? But more to be explored today. If you have recently joined our live stream, this is the live event kickoff for the new book, Lost and Found: How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us and 3 Keys to Fix It by Dr. Mark D'Souza, who we are joined by today, as well as special guest Dr. Rima Azar. And for those who have just joined, be on the lookout. Tomorrow, there is an op-ed being published in the National Post by Mark on wokeness in Canadian medicine. He is also going to be interviewed on a podcast, on the Full Comment podcast, that will be released in the next week or so. So be on the lookout for that. If you have a question for Mark or Rima, or both of them, please feel free to put it in the comments. But I have another question, or another quote to read from you that really got my attention when I first read it. So I'll just read it to you. The quote is from the book: "You can't escape pain, but suffering is optional. Being a victim is the most painful way to live, full of purposelessness, nihilism, anxiety, depression, and short-term thinking, but it's also the easiest. Taking responsibility is incredibly hard, but it also sets you free." Mark, can you talk about that?
Yeah, I love that one too, Josh. There are different facets to that quote that I want to touch on. First, I think I have a whole chapter devoted to the almost the cult of victimhood that we have in society today. I think one of the worst things that society is doing these days is incentivizing victimhood. So the more, however many mantles of victimhood you have, the more cultural power, the louder the voice, the more powerful the veto power you have. And it's really unfortunate because it's also extremely disempowering. You can always make the case that you are victimized in some way, but also, yeah, what are you going to do about it then? Because you have no way forward. Whereas taking maximal responsibility, which sometimes is a bit of it's a mental trick, like to a lot of, if you have had some hardship, perhaps it is not entirely your fault. But if you accept the mantle of absolute responsibility that there's something I could have done differently, that is extremely empowering and a way forward. And it sets you free. You won't feel, you could have pain in your life, but you won't suffer.
Rima, what do you think about that? About in our culture today, it does seem like it's easier to be a victim than, and maybe harder to just be honest. What does that look like from your experience?
Yeah, indeed. I like that chapter a lot because we see that there's like a kind of a competition of victimhood. I'm more victim than you, and sometimes we are truly victims, let's say, of abuses or whatever issues in someone's lives. We don't want to be stuck in that victim stage. At first, we need to admit we have been a victim, maybe in those cases, like truly a victim. But the idea is to thrive, not just survive, and to move on. So when we call ourselves victim, or see ourselves or see others in victims, we are not doing them a favor. We're not doing it to ourselves. It's so definitely taking responsibility, taking charge of one's life, I think.
I think so too. I feel like it's sometimes it's so easy to be a victim that it dilutes what it really means to be a victim. Whereas if you sort of just stand on what's true, then you don't have to worry about whether you are or not a victim. That's certainly something that I got out of the book. It's actually, all right, so there's this quote I read from this guy in the book. His name is Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Oh, sorry, Josh. Can I just interject on that?
Of course, yeah.
I just want to give an example that actually popped in mind because I think that'll make things a bit clearer. I don't talk about this in the book. I have Prince Harry and Meghan Markle as illustrating that point about being stuck on victimhood. But an example that's not in the book and popped in my mind is, if you remember from the previous Olympics, the Summer Olympics, Simone Biles. she was lauded in the media, lauded in the mainstream media for just, she's a gymnast for the American US team, apparently. I don't follow it that closely, but extremely talented, extremely accomplished, and then decided for mental health reasons she wasn't going to compete at a certain event. And while we should for sure have compassion for her and support her, I got the sense that there was so much of the valorization of it. And even though the Olympics are supposed to be about ideals and aiming high, it was like aiming low was aiming high, up is down, down is up. And I think it's a sign of how much the culture is tilted towards worshiping the victim. I didn't like that at all.
Yeah, that was the first time I think I'd seen that happen in the Olympics, or
I don't think
anywhere.
it'll be the
And
last
yeah,
time.
I don't think it will be. And of course, like everything in our culture today, it devolved into very two-dimensional conversations, kind of lacking nuance. If you'd like some nuance on a question like that, may I encourage you, dear reader, to go check out Lost and Found: How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us, and 3 Keys to Fix It. Okay, so the Alexander Solzhenitsyn quote, I don't know if I've ever said that right in my life, but the quote is, if living in truth is too hard, here, I'm just going to read this quote from the book. If living in truth is too hard, pick one of Solzhenitsyn's 9 rules for responsible conduct, such as, and this is the part I really like, stop saying things that you don't believe to be true, which sounds really, really simple, to stop saying things that you don't believe to be true. And yet there is such a freedom in actually practicing that. Mark, will you tell us a little bit more about stop saying things that you don't believe to be true?
Yeah, the book is meant to be also a practical guide for how to live in a society today where you actually can't, you at your own peril, you can't really say everything absolutely you believe. And so I found his work on this amazing. In 1974, he wrote this essay as he left the Soviet Union. And he said it was very practically oriented. Basically, he was telling his fellow Soviet citizens is, I get it. I know you can't just go up to Red Square and say, hey, I think your dictatorship is awful. Give us a vote. Give us democracy. I want to be able to move around the world without this sort of dictatorial regime. I think you're, anyways, that's besides the point. But yes, it comes down to truth being, there's absolute truth where you're saying, and then there are different gradations of it where you're actually not lying. So there are 9 of them, but they essentially distill down to live not by lies, which actually is the title of his essay. So how this might practically work out, I give an example in my promo videos about something ridiculous like the flat earther. Say at your work, because we all know what these taboo topics are, but so just think about that in place of flat earther. But say at the end of every work day, all your comrades get together and you have to pump your fist in the air and shout, the earth is flat 3 times, and then high five and scream. It sounds ridiculous, but in that situation, instead of doing that, just don't pump your fist in the air and don't shout it out. I'll try to give an example that I actually used because, in preparation for today, we thought about, I thought about, we do want this recording to be on Facebook and not taken down. And unfortunately, one of the reasons I wrote the book is the reason why I can't say exactly everything that I want to and give you the best example that I actually use on a day-to-day basis. But I'll give you something somewhere in the middle. I have a chapter, I'm on record, I have a chapter against diversity mandates, diversity, equity, inclusivity. It's like a mantra now, and people will almost chant diversity is our strength. It's a mantra. And I think everyone uses a different dictionary. The people on top, the elites that want to force this down on us, they use a different dictionary depending on who they're talking to, and what they mean and what they say are 2 very different things. And I might say I would not chant that if somebody that I was talking to talked about, oh, diversity is great. I wouldn't just, you could just to get along. It's easier to say yes, diversity is great, but Orwell has this quote where the words tend to warp your thoughts. So that's why the cultural left is very, very insistent on words. But instead of saying diversity is great, I either living not by lies, I won't say it. Or I might even throw out something out there in the right context if I felt comfortable enough in saying, what does diversity mean? Which I think most people cannot define. But anyways, what do you think about that, Rima? I'm sure you have your own examples, maybe some.
I have a lot to say about that. I think they accuse you of, if you're a part of minority, like visibly, we could be like myself looking, I don't know, not local where I live, let's say. They assume that you will buy into it more and say and if you don't, well, you
You're a
might be
traitor.
canceled. Right.
Yeah.
But my point is, what about diversity, intellectual diversity? What about that? We are not allowing diverse opinions, diversity of thoughts. What does it mean then to be to the diversity? And unity is strength usually. Diversity is beautiful, is amazing, is a richness, but unity is much stronger. I think.
Well, yeah. I mean, if we're riffing off that, then diversity, what does diversity mean? Does diversity go to the extent of so diverse that we're okay with people that think we're an awful and irredeemably flawed country, which we hear in Canada and the US way too much? And what is that? It's so much like diversity is at most a half truth, and then the details do matter. And people lie to you all the time as what diversity means.
Yes, and can I add to that?
Please.
Like, how can we be, like, I'm a first generation immigrant. How can you be ungrateful to that extent and start saying, like, Canada or the USA for Lebanese Americans or whatever country, adoptive country for us, start saying that it is bad, it is systemically racist, it is like saying all what we people are saying. How can we say it? We would be not only untrue, ungrateful. We didn't come here, we would have not immigrated here had it been to that extent that bad. No country is perfect, of course, and trust me, I know what I'm talking about. No country is perfect, but our countries deserve our respect, and the past as well, which is not perfect, the present, the future.
But every country's like that. You know, Josh is American, and one of the things in your country that just still echo in my mind is reading that in Dearborn, Michigan, they're loudly chanting "Death to America." One of the deeper themes of my book is choosing gratitude and appreciation. And so when I hear that, I think the people chanting that are you're a psychopathic narcissist that want to destroy that hate your own country and see they need help, mental.
Yeah.
They need professional help. Or they're just they need a taste of going back to a different country and realizing how great. What are the actual, or if not perfect, because no country is perfect, but what are the good parts of this country that they're missing out on? And they're doing it while live streaming from their iPhones.
Yeah, and there it is. There it is. And the live streaming from the iPhones. There it is.
It's sad. It's sad.
Yeah. We have a couple questions coming in from the audience, by the way. So thank you to those viewers who have put some questions in the chat. We will be asking those momentarily, but first, I think one of the highlights of the launch is going to be a reading from the book. Mark, are you ready to do a reading?
Yeah, and excuse my eyes go to my side monitor for this, but I'll just do the reading and then you can see why. I'll talk about why I chose this particular one. One of the more remarkable cases of my drug addiction patients left a deep impression on me. For confidentiality, let's call him John. John was a young man who had trouble maintaining a job. In opioid addiction care, patients ideally get on methadone or buprenorphine as replacement opioids that give less of a high but prevent withdrawal symptoms. Patients give urine samples, often at weekly intervals, that are tested for the presence or absence of drugs. John kept testing positive for illicit drug use week after week. I was dismayed at how such a young person that I believed to have far more potential could just go through the motions of life and let his promise slip away. This pattern continued week after week, month after month. Suddenly, one day, his urine test was negative for anything but what I prescribed. I believed it must be an aberration, and the next week he would be back to testing positive for recreational drugs. Yet the next week, he was also clean. He was clean the week after that, and the week after that. What had changed? He told me that growing up, he had a dream of getting his pilot's license. More recently, he investigated this process and found that to do so, he cannot be on any opioid, including the one I prescribed to keep him away from illicit drugs. He also said he needed to have records on his medical file showing that for a long period of time, his urine samples were clean. John never tested positive again with me. Months later, I tapered him off buprenorphine, and then he only had periodic visits with me. Still, all his urine tests were clean. I was not only impressed, but inspired. The last time I saw him, he had started his pilot's license training. In those last few months, he seemed happy and motivated. I realized what he was missing all this time that made the entire difference was purpose, a life mission. John and other cases like his have been my inspiration for writing this book. People like John have illuminated a crucial insight. Western society is increasingly losing touch with a sense of purpose. To counteract existential malaise and restore meaning to our lives, it is imperative that we embrace and pursue clear goals and values.
I'm just gonna clap because I'm the only one who can. Me and Rima, only ones who can clap. No, that's great, and I think there's such a unique perspective that you bring to this issue with your background in medicine. And maybe you could talk about that. So that passage is very, I think, illuminating to your personal perspective as a practitioner who's dealt with painkillers and people who are sort of addicted to them. How does that kind of lend a perspective to this world we're talking about of victimhood and the indulgence in victimhood and the ease of victimhood? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so one of the central arguments I make is that we all self-harm. Everybody, you, me, Rima, maybe not Rima, you and me, Josh, we self-harm in proportion to how much meaning we lack in our life. And so I saw the extremes of this with the most obvious and worst part of self-harm that people do, which is IV opioids. And I saw that, and seeing this case of this patient, John, who all, and his was a complete illustration of how, just the lack of meaninglessness. I'm just going to take drugs. I'm just going to take drugs and potentially risk my life every single time I do this. And that's what people do to harm themselves for the lack of meaning. For me, I can give the example that I give in the book is, I'm sure this is common for a lot of people here, is mindlessly watching Netflix shows, wondering a few times, I'm not even interested in this. Why am I watching this? So that is one of my self-harms. It's something I've been aware of, but everyone has something, whether it's smoking, alcohol, things that we know is not in our best rational interest. But, back to this particular case, he showed me that all you needed, like, these people are crying out for purpose. Man does not live on bread alone is a very powerful passage from the Bible. And I think, to solve the opioid crisis, policy and government should not just be a way of enabling people to just, okay, well, we're going to take care of everything for you. Here are your handouts, and here's everything you need. And in Canada, and I know in some places in the US, here are your drugs and here are your paraphernalia. That robs them of any sense of being able to find meaning in their life. So we have to enable people like them to rediscover that purpose, like my one patient did so inspiringly.
You actually managed to answer one of the questions from the chat at the same time.
Okay.
One of the viewers wanted to know about interested in learning more about what you learned from your addictions practice. So I think we should take a couple of questions from the audience. In response to that question, though, I will also say, just for folks who have tuned in recently to the live stream, this is the virtual kickoff for a new book, Lost and Found: How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us and 3 Keys to Fix It, by Dr. Mark D'Souza. Mark has also written an op-ed that's going to be published tomorrow in the National Post about wokeness in Canadian medicine. So if you, like this particular member of the audience who asked the question about learning more about Mark's practice with addictions medicine, would like to learn more about the intersection of these two topics, that will be published tomorrow in the National Post. There will also be a podcast episode of the Full Comment podcast where Mark is interviewed. That's coming out within the next week or so. All right, let's take a couple of more questions. In fact, the follow-up question, very, very timely, actually, is, okay, so Mark, connected to your insights as a doctor here, why do people do drugs, and how and why do they quit? It's an interesting question.
Why do people do anything that self-harms? And I think my deeper answer is still looking for something orienting them in life to something, a deeper purpose. So why do they quit? I think I tried to answer that with the previous examples. Why do they quit? In the book, I have these somewhat woo-woo, but explanation of levels of energy where it is completely abstract and meant to be a metaphor. But sometimes when why do I quit? So you find a deeper purpose and then you try to quit, but there are many barriers to actually quitting. One of which is your friend group. So that's a huge thing. That's not specifically in the book, but I do talk about the book as people are high vibration, low vibration, medium vibration. And so when you're just going through the motions of life and taking drugs to dive into the pain of your life, or to paper over the pain of your life, to cope with the pain of your life, your existence, the existential suffering, then and when you try to quit it and you're ready to quit it and you find that meaning, you try to get out. But then there's that recoil effect where if you keep the same group of friends, they will pull you back in. It's very hard to it latches onto you like a demonic force. I mean that very metaphorically, but still. So you need that spiritual transformation, and I need like a complete. I think that's why AA works. You need that complete redesigning of your blueprint and then break with your past. You need to let go of that past. And I do have this passage this concept in my book called Levels of Trauma Processing, which we have somewhat touched upon when I talked about victimhood. But there's this, once you're fixated on being a victim, it's actually better than not even speaking about the bad things that you've gone through. But if you keep speaking about it and fixating on about it, and most importantly, identifying with it, you will never get past it and you'll keep doing the drugs. So at some point, whatever trauma that may have caused you to, say, take drugs, and you have to let that go and it becomes a part of you and not you. And then you can transcend it, and then you got to find a different group of friends. And then, but perhaps the first thing is find that orienting thing in your life, that purpose, such as, doesn't have to be trying to fly planes, but give you something else. And I give some examples of practical first steps in the book on how to do this in the responsibility chapter.
Yes, I won't spoil it, but this may be one of the 3 keys. For those wondering, what are the 3 keys to fix it? This might be one of them. Thank you for that question from the viewers. An adjacent question. I think this question was asked when you were giving the example of being at a Flat Earthers event and chanting with the crowd. So the question is, what about when your livelihood or physical safety depends on quote unquote chanting with the crowd? Kind of similar, right? Almost like I don't want to put words in the questioner's mouth, but like a peer pressure almost.
Yeah, and I think that's a very real situation everybody faces. I don't have a 100% answer of that because it's a judgment call. I think if you're asking that question, you're already in really good stead because it means you're aware. And so, I mean, sometimes if you have to break the 9 rules of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, maybe you have to, but just understand you're paying a price, and maybe that price is worth it in the moment. But if you keep paying that price, you're going to pay another price. So you're going to pay a price regardless. You're going to pay a price in that moment if you don't chant, perhaps with the peer pressure. If they're like, come on, Joe, why aren't you chanting Flat Earther? Your job is on the line. But and then maybe you chant in that moment, but then understand that you've ended up in the situation because there's been a cascade of decisions or lack of decisions to leave that group that you saw that was tilting in this very awful, pathologized direction. So be conscious about it if you have to do it, and try to get your life in order enough to be able to leave that pathologized group.
Rima, before we move on to the next question, as somebody who did break away from the crowd, what advice would you give to somebody who is feeling that pressure, that peer pressure, to say the right thing or a certain thing at work, or to act a certain way, and it's not really the truth to you? What would you say to somebody trying to figure that out?
I really liked, I'm going to answer the question. I like when you said being conscious, so lucidity, like knowing what is happening, being aware is already key. And okay, if someone wants to do it, maybe someone else with freedom, right? So I'm personally, for me, freedom means the whole world. Like freedom is one of maybe the most important value for me. Because freedom in relationships, whether friendships or love, is freedom to allow someone to be whom they are and us to be whom we are. So we cannot impose opinions. Or for me, Bambi's Afkar, my blog, is my space of freedom. I write whatever I write. I choose the song that I want to anyone, like and yeah, it's just. I'm going to say an example from my story. When the story happened at the beginning, it's so brutal. Like you have like that machine or train coming at you, the censorship. But at the same time, there is a Lebanese saying that goes like this: a cow, when it falls, many butchers come, they want a piece of it. So you have you're dealing with what is happening and you want to fight, but at the same time, you have people maybe in my case, it happened, threatening to beat me, or people rejoicing, or people encouraging the mob. So deciding, what do you do with that? Do you fight? Do you monitor? Do you wait? You go. So maybe going with our personality, because we will get a lot of advice. And at the end of the day, it's up to us to judge with the input that we have at that moment, what to do, what not to do. So knowing oneself, I think.
I think so. Knowing oneself. I think, Mark, you're right. Even asking that question probably means you're on the right track. If you're not asking that question, maybe you aren't aware of it yet. Good question from the audience. Let's take one more from the viewers, and then maybe we will go to another passage from the book. But another question was asked. I'm just going to read it, actually. It says, Mark, what advice would you give people to help them get out of the victim mentality and come to a place of forgiveness? Perceiving oneself as a victim and unforgiveness, in my opinion, often go hand in hand. So I can read it again, actually. So,
no, yeah.
Go
Maybe
ahead.
one more time.
Yeah, I will.
I think I
So they
got
are
it, but
looking
maybe
for
one more
advice.
time just to.
I will. So, Mark, what advice would you give people to help them get out of the victim mentality and come to a place of forgiveness? And then the person who asked the question notes, perceiving oneself as a victim and unforgiveness, in my opinion, often go hand in hand. But the question is, what advice would you give people to help them get out of the victim mentality and come to a place of forgiveness?
The forgiveness part is a difficult one. That's something that's I'm gonna start with the other one first. The getting out of the victim mentality is actually it's taking responsibility, and rather than go say you're gonna go save the third world, instead it can be just little things as hey, like one of the examples I give in my book in the literally the responsibility chapter is start working on better sleep habits or exercise habits or eating habits, something small. Start a habit and then taking better self-care, and then you can increase responsibility in other dimensions such as friends, being there for more for friends, more for your taking more responsibility at work. There's also the mentality aspect, which is it's almost like you have to psych yourself out. Is that anything that has been anything where you think you're victimized you actually have to say no, it was my fault, and here's why. You try your best to take on that. No, I'm taking responsibility for this, me being in this situation. So for example, if I happen to find myself in a job where everyone has to chant for the flat earther, then I'm taking responsibility because I actually chose to work at that place and I ignored all the signs it was going to becoming a flat earther, pump your fist in the air kind of work. In terms of forgiveness, I think that's a deeper one. It's one where maybe seeking professional mental help might be helpful, or just a friend to talk to, someone who's loving and caring and sees the best in you. Maybe it's your spouse. Hopefully it is. And someone and ultimately no one can really forgive yourself but yourself. Rima, do you need to add to that?
I agree that forgiveness part is tough, not on me personally. I tend to forgive, but it's a journey, right? In some cases, maybe we should not give, or if we forgive, not forget. So like we're not dumb,
yes.
We forgive.
Separate the forgiveness.
We want to protect ourselves. It all comes to protecting oneself. So I agree that it's a tricky one and should not be forced, but maybe sometimes we need professional help indeed, but other times simply being friend with ourselves or having friends or reading books like Lost and Found. See, I like the book a lot. Finding our ways.
Speaking of the book, great questions from the viewers. If there are other questions, we may have time for one or two more at the end, but I will definitely want to make sure that we save time for a final reading from the book. That is, of course, the main event. Mark, I think you have one more passage prepared for us. If you would like to read it, we can all listen, and then maybe we'll go from there to some sort of closing thoughts and final questions. But do you want to do the final reading?
Speaking of closing thoughts, I mean, this really is the last couple passages of the book, and although we were trying not to give spoilers, this is essentially my argument and my message of hope and why I wrote the book, and it's phrased in another way. So I skip a middle section where it's practical first steps you can do, which could actually help answer some of the other questions that we've answered. But I'll say to that, just read that part of the book. I now invite people to recognize the problem in today's world and to make a choice to right the ship. Choose dialogue over monologue, free speech over political correctness, gratitude over suffering, hard work over handouts, and virtue doing instead of virtue signaling. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. Be a victor instead of a victim. Choose faith and reason together. Instead of pathological altruism, how about loving encouragement? Beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Instead of accepting semantically appealing ideas at face value, think critically about the pros and the cons. Be civil without being censored. Remember that the ends do not justify the means, and take the plank out of your own eye before scapegoating someone else. And then I have a little bit about first steps someone can take, which I'm skipping. Plato and Socrates once discussed the allegory of a cave with respect to the search for truth. In this scenario, a group of prisoners lived chained to the wall of a cave their entire lives. They watched shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them. While these are only shadows, they believe this is their reality. One day, a prisoner is freed. The prisoner represents a philosopher. He explores and finds his way out of the cave. The never-before-seen sunlight hurts his eyes, just as the truth is often painful. But he knows this is closer to objective reality. Excitedly, he tells the prisoners of his discovery, thinking they will all jump for joy. To his surprise, most of them want to stay exactly where they are, in their fantasy world, staring at the wall, no matter how painful it is. Not only that, like the Grand Inquisitor to Jesus, they will fight and even kill him if he tries to drag them out. This is my motivation for writing this book. I see the disintegration of the greatness of the West, the taking for granted of our freedoms, the utter lack of appreciation for the good things we have, and an attraction for reality distortion. It's not perfect, and no utopia doesn't exist. But if we stop absconding responsibility and denigrating traditional structures of meaning, we might not feel so empty inside. We might even be happy. And if we, above all, foster dialogue with open hearts and minds among ourselves, we can all together move out of the cave and into the sunlight of reality. If my three meta-solutions were a triangle, the base would be free speech, providing the foundation, while traditional religion and responsibility would form the sides. Free speech will give us the best chance of figuring out not just all the difficult questions this book has brought up, but it is a mechanism for always being as close to truth as humanly possible. What a world that would be.
Yeah. Back when you used to do events at bookstores, you never would clap in a reading. Thank you for that as well. If you enjoyed that reading, that was just a sample from Lost and Found: How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us and 3 Keys to Fix It, read by the author, Mark D'Souza. I think we're just about coming to the end here. If you have any last questions, viewers, please feel free to put them into the chat. I will ask both Mark and Rima maybe 1 or 2 more questions that maybe we can sort of also start expressing some closing thoughts with. In fact, I'll make it 2 questions. So if you want to save closing thoughts, you can make it the second question. This is an interesting one though. This is another quote from the book, very much connected to the excerpt that you read from. So it says, speech, thought, writing, and action are fundamentally interconnected. Impede one and all others suffer. So speech, the things we say; thought, the things we think; writing, things we write; and actions, the thing that we do. If one of them is impeded, for example, by victimhood or self-censorship, then all others suffer. That really resonated with me personally. Mark, can you maybe just flesh that out a little bit, maybe with an example of how impeding one, maybe speech, maybe impeding free speech, makes the other suffer?
I have an example in my book where I go through one of these processes where I did have a patient complaint, and as it's a very bureaucratic process to get one. formally in Canada. And so that process went on for year after year. And I had my lawyer had advised me, no, you have to just say mea culpa and everything, and what an awful person you are, and or doctor, and then how great the teaching was from the elites on high. And I found that it was very difficult to simultaneously do that and also go and work for, well, it would end up being 4 years while this thing dragged on, and also think, no, I can do this. And it brought me to the point of having to I almost left medicine entirely in 2015. But had I done that again, I probably would have just followed more closely to what Solzhenitsyn says and try to live not by lies and not BS. So no, I'm a terrible doctor. Please, like, you guys are great, and please tell me how terrible I am. But I think an even better example is, tell me if this is correct, Rima, but I love your blog. I see I see the freedom that it allows you. We've never talked about this before, but I see that your blog is an example of someone who is just Bambi is released into the wild, and you're just whatever comes to mind. I think it is probably the best. It allows you to feel like mentally as sharp as possible and sleep at night and look yourself in the mirror. And what do you think about that?
Thank you. I would say I've always loved to write. So during Civil War, that was my coping mechanism. It's like a diary. And I see that as a virtual diary every day. And indeed, I just write what I want. And I love what the reader, like you have commented recently, I'm honored. When people write and we may not agree, we may agree. That's not the issue. That's secondary. So what I'm thinking, when you write, you think about matters, you clarify things. Maybe tomorrow I will not think about an issue. I thought about it the same way. We learn, we move. There's nothing set in stone in life. So thank you for saying what you said. If I may add one more thing from what you said, Josh, about the behavior, the act, the thought. For me, it comes down to authenticity. So if we are authentic, we're happier first, because it's easier to be oneself, but it's also hard on authentic people nowadays in our what I call collectively insane times, where like we're walking on eggshells, limiting ourselves, so how can we be authentic in that world? I refuse. I'm sorry. And I see that your book is a form of resistance, civilized, peaceful. Is there anything more peaceful than a pen? So thank you for your book.
And I think as you're coming to how like people are very censored these days, and how are we suffering as a society because people are not allowed to express themselves? And I think if society, Western society right now was metaphorically as a person, I would look at them as someone who's very depressed and anxious, because and it's induced by the severe censorship that's increasing. And so we want to reverse that.
If you also would like to reverse it, this book is called Lost and Found: How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us in 3 Keys to Fix It. We have another question from the audience, and then we'll close with one final quote from the book. Question from the viewers is, you reference many philosophers when making your arguments for the book. Which idea or metaphor stood out the most to you? And actually, I know that's about the book for you to answer, Mark, but maybe Rima, if you also have an interesting sort of philosopher or metaphor that's kind of inspired you, maybe you could each maybe give an answer to that. But yeah, Mark, what philosopher, idea, or metaphor has kind of most stood out to you?
There's no single one, because there's so many for me. But if I were to pick just one, I'll just actually riff off of the reading that I just did, where hands up if you're a Matrix fan, if you watch The Matrix. I can imagine there's obviously I can't see, but the Plato's allegory of the cave is, I think that's what The Matrix was based out of. I know the actual producers talked about the allegory of talk about in subsequent interviews about the allegory of the cave. But basically, I think that's what we're doing is everyone is having, I have to get this right. The blue pill is the one. Yes, the blue pill, people are just addicted to blue pills. We're all just taking these easy lies. It's a very easy path of living, and the reality distortion and anything to make us comfortable in the moment. Yeah, what we want to be doing is digesting the red pills. So It's not a specific quote, but it was a metaphor from Plato.
All right. And Rima, do you have a philosopher or idea or metaphor that kind of stands out to you when you think about this topic?
I will simply add not a specific philosopher. I love philosophy. That I admire your knowledge and your passion for humanities and philosophy. And you reminded me of many things I may have forgotten myself or studied in school. So I just want to say that for me, I mentioned earlier, know yourself, Socrates, right? Like connais-toi
Yeah.
toi-même in French. That really is something I think that has been important for me throughout my own story journey. Always remembering whom coming to us within before like accusing others, looking within. And when you said, Mark, like knowing what if we did something wrong, let's say whatever it is knowing what belongs to us and what belongs to the other. And we can only have control over healthy control, I mean, over
Ourselves,
ourselves only in life. That's it.
Thank you both. All right. So thank you for that question from the viewers. Last thought for the day today, and then we're going to wrap up. Thanks for everybody for joining. I'll give some a final sort of heads up on what's coming next in a moment here. But we started today talking about hope and hoped that we wouldn't say it too many times. And now we end, and I'm wondering if you can leave us, Mark, with some practical advice. So the quote that I'm referencing is, I have made it a practice to praise people who express disagreement with me civilly and encourage them to elaborate. I am absolutely open to seeking truth together. So, all right. So you're in a conversation with somebody, you disagree with them. It's really hard to do what you just said, right? It's really hard to encourage them to elaborate and be open to seeking truth together. So what advice would you leave us with on how to do that practically in 2024 election year? Disagreement is at an all-time high. What advice would you give us?
Yeah, it is hard. It is hard to do that. I think it to me that is the practical step you can at least try to do to reverse this whole echo chamber tribal mentality that we're all into, where we just ignore anyone that disagrees with us. You almost have to assume that Socratic humility that, okay, let's just assume the other person is right. Please explain to me, because I actually want to, if I'm wrong, please, I actually want to know that. And if I'm not wrong or I'm partially wrong, I actually want to see your perspective so I can strengthen what my understanding of the argument is. Now, people might be stunned that you're interested in this, in their argument, because they're not used to people actually praising them for disagreeing. If they come from a good place and they have a good heart and open-minded, I really want them to know that thank you so much for disagreeing and expressing it. If you're interested, I throw it out there, let's dive deeper. And then what's important too, let's talk about the pros and the cons, because you also don't want it to end up as them just doing a very one-sided view and also not open to more of a granularity of the topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rima. Hopefully those of you who tuned in have enjoyed the hour. Just a reminder, the book is called Lost and Found, How Meaningless Living is Destroying Us and 3 Keys to Fix It. I think you can see it behind me. It's available almost anywhere books are sold. You can go to Mark's website to learn more at markdesouza.md.com. There is a op-ed being published tomorrow in the National Post by Mark on wokeness in Canadian medicine, so don't miss that. And then stay tuned as well. Mark is going to be interviewed on an episode of the Full Comment podcast that will be coming out within the next week or so. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that. Thank you to all the viewers. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to Mark and to Rima. Go get the book. It's a great book. One of the best I've read. It's really enlightening. It's very timely, very refreshing. So thanks to all and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rima. And then one more, and thank you to everyone. And one more very special thank you. This book really would not have been possible above all with one person. And for that, I really want to heartily thank my wife. There's every sentence was read to her. Everything was bounced off of her. So if you don't like the book, you can blame her too.
No.
Yeah, this is it would not have been possible with her. So thank you.
I think I should extend that thanks as well, because without that, I would not have had a chance to read it. You will, everybody out there tuning in, this is a great book. Go check it out. It's worth the time to spend. You learn a lot, learn about yourself, about the world you live in. Highly recommended. So thanks to all. Have a great rest of your Tuesday afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.